So let me read this section from Genesis chapter 29. If you have a Bible or if you're on a computer and you're able to, pull up this passage, Genesis 29, 15 through 28, okay? Genesis 29, verses 15 through 28, and follow along. It'll help you to kind of understand it better if you're looking at it as I'm reading it. I'm reading from the NIV, but you can use whatever translation you would like. Just know it'll be a little bit different. So starting in verse 15, Jacob had already come to the well. He had met Rachel at the well, and he really just loved her from the start, and he wanted to marry her right off the bat. He had gone to Haran to his uncle Laban's place, and so he goes back and he's with Laban and kind of hears what's happened. So Laban said to Jacob, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, which I want y'all to pay attention to that. There's a footnote. By weak, Leah had weak eyes, and it says down at the bottom, or delicate eyes. I tend to think that this is not saying Leah had bad eyes, but Leah had beautiful and delicate eyes, okay? So Leah had delicate eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I will work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." So Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." And so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. But they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. He loved Rachel, but he didn't have any money. He didn't have anything to offer, so he had to kind of work because typically a man would have to kind of give a blessing of money, of wealth, if he was going to marry a daughter and a family. And so then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." He was ready. 7 years, long time. And so Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. And Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. And so he was tricked, right? Likely she came in with a veil on. And maybe they'd been drinking a lot, and so he ended up making love to the wrong person, to Leah instead of Rachel. When morning came, there was Leah. And so Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" And Laban replied, "It is not our custom to give our younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish the daughter's bridal week, and then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And so Jacob did so, and he finished the week of Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And so they go another 7 years of him working again for Rachel. And so I wanted to read this story because it's a really weird, complicated story in some ways. And it's a messy story for me as I read it. I don't necessarily think that there's a whole lot of redeeming action that's happening in this story. But I want to break down some things for you, and then we will mention this story just a bit. And so my sermon is just going to be fairly simple, but hopefully it's going to give meaning. It's going to be meaningful to us in this current time and place that we're in. I reminded you a few weeks ago of this truth that I want to remind you about today, that Genesis is an ancient book. Okay? It is an ancient book. We have to realize that. It was not written a few years ago. It wasn't written 100 years ago. It wasn't written a few hundred years ago. This is a really, really, really old book. And what that means is that there is vast distance. All right, ancient can be talked about as distance. Vast distance between the world of Genesis and the world of today. All right, there is vast distance between then and now. And so this is important for us to pay attention to because their customs, their language, their humor, their interests, their moral sensibilities, all of it is very distant from our world today. Therefore, we can't read Genesis as if these characters are living out their stories in 21st century America. I think we often read these stories and we want to act like they're kind of living it out today in the way we live. But that's not the case. They were living a very long time ago. There is vast distance between then and now. All right, and so we need to understand it's an ancient book. And therefore, if it's an ancient book, then we must understand context. All right, and I've talked about context. You cannot read the Bible and understand it unless you understand the context of the Bible. And there are two different time periods that we need to understand. We need to understand Jacob's context. What was Jacob's world like? What was Abraham, his grandfather's world like? What was Isaac's world like? Context really helped us understand when Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. It helped us to make sense of that story. It also helped us to understand why the firstborn son got so hooked up in the family and got all this blessing and wealth. And so we need to understand what was going on in that world and time and place right then when Jacob was living. But number two, we've got to understand too the context of the writers of Genesis, the people who wrote the book, what was going on in their world when they decided to write this book down. Now, you may not know this, and believe it or not, but the evidence shows that Genesis likely didn't get written until hundreds of years after the events of Genesis happened. All right, and so Jacob lived, and Leah and Rachel and Laban, when all that was going on, there was stuff going on in the world then, but Genesis probably actually didn't get written down in its final form for hundreds of years after these events happened. And that may bother you. You may be like, well, what? How did they remember the stories? How do we know they're accurate? Well, these stories were so important to them. And back then, in ancient culture, stories were mostly passed down orally, generation to generation. They didn't have printing presses. They couldn't make tons and tons of manuscripts for everybody to have their own copy so they could read it. Many people didn't even know how to read if they had a manuscript. And so these oral traditions, these stories were passed down and preserved from generation to generation. And another thing to consider is they all had better memories than we do, I think, because they didn't have access to manuscripts. They had to know these stories. They had to memorize them. They preserved them, and they cherished them. And so keeping these stories alive and telling them was so important in their culture. And the cool thing about a story is that a story can take on new life and meaning depending on the situation of the person hearing it or telling it. During the Israelites' time, let's fast forward just a few years, when they were in the wilderness, after they'd been in Egypt for quite a long time as slaves, I imagine when they heard these origin stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Leah and Rachel and Rebekah and Sarah, I imagine that they had like a new meaning for them. They took on a new meaning as they were living in the wilderness, and they probably spoke to them in a unique way. Fast forward to the time of the Judges, a really hard time for the Israelites. I imagine these origin stories about the origins of their faith took on new meaning for them in those moments. During the reigns of King David and King Solomon, they probably spoke to them. These stories in Genesis spoke to them in a new and unique way. Just like today when we read these stories and we hear them, they speak to us in kind of a new and fresh and meaningful way, and they speak new life into our current situation. So what happened is eventually the Israelites, they've been telling these stories for so long, they decided we need to write them all down. Some of them had already probably been written down, but they wanted to put them all together in a cohesive book so that they would never lose these stories that meant so much to them. And so this book that they put together came to be known as the book of Genesis. All right, the book of Genesis, and that's what we've been studying. All right, and it's important to pay attention that the book of Genesis is not just a freestanding book. It was meant to be part of a larger series, a 5-part series called the Torah. All right, and so you need to understand that it's part of a 5-part series. There are 4 other books in this series: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this 5-part series was named the Torah. It wasn't written by one author. There were many authors that wrote these books, but these editors at one point decided they were going to put them all together in a cohesive fashion and tell the story of the origins of the Israelite faith. And the Torah is some of the most important stuff in the Hebrew Bible. And so the question I want to ask is this: what prompted the Israelites to complete the book of Genesis? Why did they finally decide we need to put these stories down? We need to put them in a cohesive way so that we can preserve this forever. What was the historical context of the people who pulled these stories together and finally finished the book of Genesis? What was going on? Because if we can understand the context of the folks who wrote it, then we can learn a great deal about what makes this book so special. And here's the short answer that I'm going to give you. Genesis was born out of a national tragedy. Genesis was born out of a national tragedy. The complete work of Genesis, this is what a lot of scholars agree on, it was likely finished as a response to the awful national tragedy of being forced into exile. What happened, this is probably the most tragic thing that happened to the Israelites. And I'll tell you that, in America, 9/11 is one of those markers, a national tragedy for us. This was like 9/11, but far, far worse. This pandemic may become the greatest national tragedy we've had in a long time. But think about what the Israelites were going through. In 586 BC, the ruthless Babylonian Empire, they were seeking to conquer all kinds of lands, and they finally, in some reason, this little piece of land in the Middle East that is modern-day Israel and Palestine was such a valuable piece of land because it connected kind of the northern part down to the southern part, and it was a very important piece of land. And so the Babylonians wanted it, and they finally moved into Jerusalem, and they took it. They annihilated the city. And not only did they destroy the city, they destroyed the temple, which was their holy place. They destroyed the palace, and what they did is they deported many people. I've told you this before, but they practiced a scorched earth policy where they would burn and salt the fields so that nothing could grow in the fields for years. It destroyed their livelihood. They also would go and fill up the wells so that they couldn't access water. I mean, this is brutal. Complete devastation, complete destruction. Their land, their work, their religion, their political system, their families, their homes, all of it dismantled, all of it destroyed. Their lives were wrecked and turned upside down. And many of the Israelites were deported and kicked out of the land. Many of them, some of them stayed actually, but they would have just been struggling to even survive, not being able to grow things, not being able to access water. And for almost 50 years, the Israelites lived in exile, away from their homeland, struggling to believe in God and God's goodness. And they also likely struggled to believe that they could be restored. I mean, the honest ones, they knew that they had messed up. They knew that they deserved much of the judgment that they received because of the way they treated the poor, the way they neglected to live out God's calling upon their lives. And so they were struggling, wondering, is God faithful to us still? Can God forgive us? Can God restore us? And then in 539 BC, the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonians, and they allowed the Israelites to return home. And this is most likely the context for the compilers of Genesis. This is the moment when these folks decided, let's put all these different stories together. Let's put them in order. Let's structure them in such a way that will speak profound truth and show what God really is about. And it became known to be the book of Genesis. Pete Enns, a brilliant writer and scholar, says that Genesis, it's not likely written by one artist at a given moment. But instead, he says it's more like a remix. I like a good remix, right? A remix that samples other works and puts them together in a unique way to tell a story relevant to a given moment. And so they took all these stories, compiled them together in this beautiful book that we have now called Genesis. And so the question is, why was it important for the Israelites to put this origin story together in the midst of a national tragedy and trauma? Why was it so important for them to do this? What prompted them to get serious about putting Genesis together? Well, here's a guess. They were living in a very difficult and dangerous time. And perhaps they wondered, if God's promises of life and blessing and flourishing were still valid. Perhaps they wondered whether God could still work with them and through them despite their failures and their struggles. Genesis is about the resiliency of God's promises. Genesis is about the resiliency of God's promises. Time and time again, forces work against the promise, but that God's promise for the Israelite perseveres. You know, I wonder, perhaps the old stories in Genesis reminded these folks that God's promises are resilient, that God can work in and through messed up situations and circumstances. You know, as they thought about, okay, we've come back to our land after the exile, we need to rebuild our lives, perhaps being reminded of the resiliency of God's promises would have been encouraging to them and reminded them that, man, God hasn't abandoned us. God was faithful all through Genesis, and God is still faithful to us today. So it's about the promises of God and how resilient they are is what Genesis is about. But here's another unique thing about Genesis, and this is something that I think we need to pay attention to. Genesis is about real life people trying to follow God, but messing up constantly. Genesis is about real life people trying to follow God, but messing up constantly. Maybe that feels familiar to you in your own life. So Jacob, I told you just earlier in the service that Jacob could be described as really the main character in Genesis. I mean, he is all throughout Genesis. His stories, his escapades are very much a part of what this book is about. He is a very conflicted man. Very conflicted. He messes up time and time again. He lies, he cheats, he steals, he manipulates, he mistreats people, he's messy, and he struggles to follow God. He gets a lot right as well. He's got some good qualities about it. But he gets into a lot of mess, and he's involved in a lot of shady stuff. So in our story that I read for you today, you know, Jacob and Laban, and it goes on longer. This is really a big story that runs from 29 all the way to around chapter 31. It's about 3 chapters long. And I encourage you to go read the whole thing. But Jacob and Laban, the two guys in this story, do a lot of messed up stuff. A lot of messed up stuff. They use, and this one thing that really bothers me, they use the women kind of like pawns in their silly rivalry in these power moves that they were trying to exert over the other one. You know, Laban is a pretty bad father to his daughters. He doesn't seem to care to protect them at all. While Jacob is in Haran, he tricks Laban and Laban tricks him. They hurt Leah and Rachel significantly in their quest to be powerful and important. Jacob just kind of disregards Leah, and God ends up showing love to Leah, but he's like, he just kind of married her, and then he's like, but I really want Rachel. Jacob, you know, the younger one that God chose, he gets it wrong a lot in the book of Genesis. And in this story in particular, he gets it wrong a lot. And one thing y'all are going to look at next week, I believe, is Christina's going to share with you this beautiful story about Jacob wrestling with this divine being. You've probably heard this story before. But in this story, Jacob gets a new name, and it's a fitting name for him. And I'm sure Christina will break this down more for you next week, but the name Israel means one who strives with God. One who strives with God. And reference Pete Enns again, but he's argued that the story of Jacob wrestling with the divine being in Genesis, he says it's the defining story in Genesis because it's the perfect image of these characters in Genesis, that they struggle with God. Genesis is really about God's people struggling with Him, struggling to believe the promises, struggling to be faithful, struggling to allow God to work. It's a constant struggle from the beginning of the end to this book. Now, I want y'all to keep in mind, like I said, it's part 1. Genesis is part 1 of a 5-part series. And these men and women in Genesis, they were very much in the beginning stages of understanding God's will for them. Therefore, they struggle. They learn, but they struggle. They learn a lot along the way, but they have to make a lot of mistakes to get there. And actually, further generations can learn from their mistakes and maybe don't repeat all the same mistakes that they did. But they were just beginning to figure all this out. I read, and I was telling Christina this throughout the week, but I read the story of Jacob going to Haran to find a wife, and I found myself just very annoyed this week that this story is in the Bible. I just don't really like it. It bothers me. There is polygamy in this story, deceit, abuse, mistreatment of women, rivalry, shaming, jealousy, and I thought, man, I don't want to preach on this one. I just don't. And I thought, this is one of those stories I just wish wasn't in the Bible. And I'm just being honest. It's just so messy and full of struggle. And I'm like, the lectionary is forcing me to preach on this week, and I'm resisting, right? But we're going to do it. And as I've thought about it, though, more this week, as I've really reflected on how this fits into the larger narrative of Genesis, I wonder if that is precisely the reason that it's in our Bible, because it's so messy. I wonder that the fact that it's messy and full of struggle is the very reason that they decided to include it in the Bible. God gets his way in spite of the massive failures and hurtful actions of his people. God's promises and his ways are resilient. And God doesn't stop working. God keeps moving forward with his plans for our world, even in spite of us and our failures, even in spite of the kind of messed up things that they do in this book of Genesis. When we get to Exodus, we're going to see that the promise is still valid, that God was still with his people. And we will be reminded as we move through Exodus in a month or so that God's promises and God's ways are resilient, that they stand through even the powerful Pharaoh trying to get in the way of God's will. God's promises still move forward, that no matter how messed up our world is, God has a plan and God is at work. As the Israelites returned home to their decimated land after the exile, they likely struggled to have hope that God was still faithful to them. Perhaps they wondered if they had messed up too bad. And so they went back to their old stories, and they found hope there. They heard the story of Jacob and his brokenness, and his struggles and his issues, and were reminded that God was faithful to Jacob, even as Jacob struggled to be faithful to God. They were reminded that God didn't abandon his promises, even as powerful forces worked against them. And I've been thinking this week, I'm just so overwhelmed by the weight of the problems that we're facing right now. We look at our world that is so messed up, so unjust. We have lost faith in so many of our leaders. Even some of our spiritual heroes have failed us in major ways, and that's happened to me. Heroes of mine I've just seen have let me down. We wonder whether God can work in this mess that we're in. We too are facing a national tragedy, and we're all being affected by it. America's poor are being affected worse than anyone, are being traumatized once again, as they are so often by our society, being traumatized by having to take the brunt of this pandemic. Black people in America wonder whether this nation will ever right the wrongs of our past and our present. Our president continues to just push forward racist policy, vilify, demonize, oppress our immigrant neighbors. Most Americans are struggling to pay their bills and get by, while a small few continue to get richer and richer and richer and richer. And people are afraid, and they're clinging to this ideology and refusing to engage in truthful conversation. I've been so just overwhelmed by what I'm seeing on social media and just the false, just inaccurate things that are just shared constantly. And it seems like people don't even care to hear what's really going on and engage in truthful conversation. And we wonder whether God is still faithful. We wonder whether God is still at work. We wonder whether God can bring anything good out of the mess that we're in. But I'll tell you that Genesis is giving me hope because it is a messy book of great struggle, pain, violence, corruption. Yet God's promise does prevail through it. And you can see that through the entire story of the Hebrew Bible. God was faithful then through all the crazy stories in Genesis, and I believe that God is still faithful today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.